The Siege of Colchester has to be understood in terms of the wider context of England in the 1640s. Of course, it goes without saying that the 1640s was a time of great conflict in England. The civil wars raged throughout almost the entire decade. And during this period, it was the forces of the king who engaged themselves against the forces of Parliament. The king saw himself as divinely ordained, a man whose authority was absolute. He was given it by God, and he could rule as he saw fit. On the other hand, there was an ever-growing class of men who believed that the real sovereignty of England, the real political power, lied with the people, most specifically the men of means, the Parliament men. So in the 1640s, both sides gathered their armies, and the first few years of the decade were marked by pitched battles fought between both sides, with some victories on both sides. In the end, neither side could claim any prevailing victory, and so the conflict kind of died down for a short period, only to be reignited in the late 1640s. And this is the context for the Siege of Colchester. By the summer of 1648, tensions were beginning to rise once again. There were many pockets of royalist resistance throughout the country, and great efforts were being made to spark revolution, to spark an uprising against the dominant parliamentarian forces that had come to take control over vast swathes of England. However, these pockets of royalist resistance were spread far and wide. They were mostly concentrated down in the southwest and all the way up in the north of England, these traditionally Catholic areas. And they were interrupted by huge areas under parliamentarian control. In fact, the whole south and the southeast were a strongly parliamentarian area. The hopes of the forces of the royalists laid really in intervention from Scotland. They hoped that a group of Scottish royalists known as the Scottish Covenanters would eventually break through the borders, come over the Tweed and attack. Really, this never happened. They never got very far, and the Siege of Colchester has to be understood as one of the last pockets of royalist resistance. The royalists had been operating down south in Kent, trying to muster up men for an attack on Parliament. They failed and they got chased out of the area, finally going to London and other towns in the home counties before finding themselves in Colchester, a very strongly parliamentarian area in terms of the citizens. They found themselves inside the town wall, and this is where the story really begins. The final pocket of royalist resistance at the very end of the English Civil Wars. In 1648, the town of Colchester had its history forever changed by the actions of three men: Sir Thomas Fairfax, Sir Charles Lucas and George Lisle. Both Lisle and Lucas were staunch royalist supporters throughout the First Civil Wars, and in the late 1640s, as tensions and conflict had flared up again, they'd once again showed their colours. They'd been down in the south trying to raise support for an uprising against Parliament, but they'd been unsuccessful, routed by the forces of Fairfax. They moved on to London, where some staunch parliamentarian opposition made them change their plans. Finally, they moved north towards the city of Chelmsford and eventually Colchester. On the 12th of June, the parliamentarian forces led by Fairfax arrived on the outskirts of town. The royalists, determined that they would win, rode out through the town walls to meet them head on in a fearsome battle for the town. Eventually, Fairfax's forces were successful. They punctured through the royalist lines and, with extra confidence after their victories in Maidstone, they decided to push forward into the narrow streets of the town. Fairfax was forced to retreat. After the failure of the first attack, Fairfax realised that the best way to take Colchester was to settle down to a siege. He instructed his troops and regiments to disperse around the outskirts of the town, taking up positions in some of the high rolling hills that looked down on the town. The people of the town, he hoped, would rise up against their royalist masters. They had been supporters of Parliament in the First Civil War and still were. He thought he could count on them to lead an insurrection against the royalists behind the town walls. Unfortunately, that would never come. As Fairfax's men moved around the outskirts of the town to take up their siege positions, they established camps and fortifications, reinforced with numbers of artillery pieces. Somewhere on the outskirts of the town, parliamentarian forces engaged with the royalists and the home of Sir Charles Lucas was burnt to the ground. It is said that the remains of his relatives, his mother and his sister, were dug up from the family tombs and their hair was cut off and worn in the hats of the parliamentarian soldiers as a kind of magical emblem of their power over the town. Eventually, the soldiers established their camps and fortifications using wood and timber taken from the local area to establish huge palisades around their forts. Finally, the bombardment began and Colchester began to burn. This map was published in 1648 after the siege of Colchester by pro-parliamentarian forces. Of course, it shows the parliamentarian troops highly organised and their forts very well built. In reality, the scenes were probably a lot more chaotic. Nonetheless, this is a fascinating document for us because it shows us the location of the fortresses that were built around Colchester to rain down the destruction. We can see on both north and south sides of the River Colne that there are large fortifications with large artillery pieces in. We could also see the smaller fortifications built closer to the town with the smaller artillery cannons, these being linked by a strong palisade fence. We can only imagine the kind of destruction that was rained down onto the town when Fairfax gave the order for the bombardment to begin. And when it begun with ferocity. Night and day the cannons unloaded their ammunition into the town, destroying the buildings and the businesses and demoralising the inhabitants. One eyewitness described the terrible scenes in the town. How sad a spectacle it is to see goodly buildings, well-furnished houses and whole streets to be nothing but ruinous heaps of ashes, and both poor and rich brought almost to the same woeful state, to see such people scarce able to stand upon their legs, all of them wailing and weeping, ghastly countenances and meagre thin faces, shifting and flying in distractions of mind they scarce know whither. Some desperate women went to the gates to beg for mercy. They were shown none, stripped naked and returned. Mothers tried to feed their starving children. In the end, they had to eat the meat of their own pet dogs, and when they were gone, they had to eat the meat of cats. Finally, there was nothing left but to eat the scraps of meat from the rats that ran around the stinking piles of garbage, and when they were finished, there was nothing left but the animal fat candles on their bedside table. Law and order broke down, so the royalists used martial law to impose their will on the people. The average citizen of the town must have looked at the burning cinders and wondered what he'd done to deserve God's wrath in this way. On the 24th of August 1648, after 11 weeks of a brutal siege, the worst in British history, Thomas Fairfax halted the attack. He'd been delivered of a message that claimed of Oliver Cromwell's great victory over the royalist forces at Preston. With this news delivered to the royalists, they knew that the game was up. There was going to be no relief force. They had hoped throughout the siege that the Earl of Holland might come and rescue them, or that some other royalist forces might be able to muster enough troops to come and relieve the pressure to destroy that parliamentarian siege. But it never happened. The last pocket of royalist resistance was now destroyed. Sir Thomas Fairfax had the upper hand. He marched his troops triumphantly into the town, and he said that all officers over the rank of captain would be captured and their futures could not be guaranteed. However, all of the ordinary troops and soldiers under the rank of captain would be released. They'd be given food and shelter as long as they swore an oath never to take up arms against Parliament again. For the people of the town, this must have been an enormous relief. Finally, there was some light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe, just maybe, life could get back to how it was before the siege. But for two important men, their futures were doomed. Both Lyle and Lucas were imprisoned briefly before being executed around the back of the Norman castle that stands in the town centre, shot by a parliamentarian firing squad for treason. So the Siege of Colchester is not necessarily the most important battle of the Civil War, but it marked a turning point in the late 1640s, the Second Civil War, when parliamentarian forces sent a message to the rest of the nation that they were in control. The sheer brutality of the siege, the ruthlessness with which it had been carried out, was a sign to anybody who felt like taking arms against Parliament that their cause was futile. So never again, after this point, would royalist forces emerge to take on the might of the parliamentarian army. Eventually, within a year, the king himself was executed and the civil wars had come to an end.